This episode of Zero Cafe is made possible by our partners Convert.com, Online Dialogue, Content Square, SiteSpect, Online Influence Institute and VWO. Today I talk with Chad Sanderson, who is the head of product for the data platform team at Convoy, where he manages Convoy's internal experimentation and machine learning platform, along with data warehousing, streaming and discovery tools. We're talking about why they built their own experimentation tool. We talk about how they are managing their internal experimentation culture and how to run offline experiments. In case you missed it, in the previous episode we spoke with Tim Ash about his new book, Unleash Your Primal Brain. You can listen to that episode on the Zero Cafe website or in the podcast app you're listening with right now. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 2.
Right now I'm working at a company called Convoy. They're a digital freight brokerage. I can talk a little bit more about them later. But as for me, I'm running their data platform team. So data platform is sort of a multidisciplinary data-related pod space, which includes like our data warehouse, all of our data infrastructure tooling, data visualization, our machine learning platform, and then also our experimentation team, which we've not only built a center of excellence there, but we've also built a tool from the ground up. Before this, I was at Microsoft, where I helped run their experimentation platform along with Ronnie Kohavi, sort of the grandfather of A/B testing. And then prior to that, I was at Sephora and Subway doing very similar things.
Yeah. And you're now at Convoy for roughly 1 year?
About a year.
And what was the status of Zero at Convoy before you started?
Yeah, I mean, Convoy was very, they love testing. In fact, part of our WBR, which is our weekly business review, where all the leadership sits down and looks at key metrics and how they're performing, most of those actually have to be validated by an A/B test. So experimentation is a pretty deep part of the culture. I think some of the other aspects of CRO that you and I are familiar with haven't gotten quite as deep yet, especially on the marketing side. But on the product side, they're doing a pretty good job.
Okay, nice. And one of the topics we wanted to talk upon, touch upon today, is building your own experimentation platform.
Yeah.
So was it already done when you started at Convoy, or?
We had a pretty rough tool. It did a few things relatively well. It did a few things very, very poorly. So over the last year, we've put a lot of time and effort and energy into actually making it serviceable to most of our customers.
Yeah. So many people might now be wondering why. There's right. So many options on the market. Why would you build your own A/B testing platform?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's also usually the first one I always get when I bring up that we've built something. The main reason is that when we were essentially deciding what direction we wanted to take the team, like all of Convoy as a whole, we sat down and we thought about the problems that we had specific to our business and what our problems were probably going to be in the future, and then looked at the market of A/B testing tools and says, do any of these actually satisfy those problems to a degree that we would feel comfortable with and happy with? And our answer to that question was no. And there were a few specific, very, very specific problems that we absolutely needed solved. So for example, we needed the ability to tie all of our experiments back to metrics like margin and profit, and sometimes very algorithmically complex metrics that are all calculated offline. And at the time, the tools that we saw couldn't support that. We also needed a lot more complex statistical test designs than a t-test. Convoy has a super small business. We only have around 50,000 customers or truckers that we work with, and a much smaller number of shippers, like around 100 or maybe even less. So if you don't have a huge sample size, then your test design has to be relatively complex. It has to do a lot of interesting things. And we needed a tool that could support a pretty wide degree of complexity, and we just didn't see that out there.
Yeah, so in that sense, it's more like a B2B, smaller business case that might be that it might be helpful to build your own tool. But then again, you still need to have the luxury of being able to build it. So do you have developers in-house? Is it something you outsourced? How did that happen?
Yeah, we have developers in-house. So there are right now, there are 4 engineers that are working on the experimentation platform. I think for the first year or so, there was 2. I didn't join as a product lead until last year. So now we have 4 engineers. There's 1 engineering manager that sort of manages everybody across all of data platform, and then myself to sort of help out with vision and direction.
Yeah. And I almost hear our listeners through the channels screaming, but how did you build a business case for this? Some people already did this. I mean, hiring 4 people to build your experimentation platform, that sounds way more expensive than just, I don't know, using a random A/B testing tool.
Yeah,
maybe even the most expensive one.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it probably is. I think so. Like I sort of mentioned, when we sort of did our cost benefit analysis, the question that we asked is, if we paid, and I don't know off the top of my head how much like A/B testing, third-party A/B testing tools cost these days, but we'll just throw out a number and say like $300, $300,000. So okay, $300,000. That's basically at startup costs, like maybe 1.5 developers. Maybe you could even make the case for 1 if it's a pretty senior developer. If we go with a tool that doesn't allow us to do the things that we functionally need it to do, where are we going to lose experimentation? Like, where are we not going to be able to do tests? Well, yeah. We're actually not going to be able to do tests on the vast majority of our machine learning models. And machine learning is the essence of Convoy. So, and just take a step back to sort of explain what Convoy is, because this may make more sense. Convoy is a digital freight brokerage. And that means that when a shipper has freight that they want to move between 2 points on a map, usually they don't go directly to the trucker that's going to be carrying that freight. There's just so many things that could go wrong. The carrier might have a family emergency, and then all of a sudden you have this critical load that's just sitting there, and now there's no backup. So a broker sits in between the shipper and the trucker, and as freight comes in, they're the ones responsible for making sure it's paired up with the right most economic person to take that load. Convoy has entered the space and said, we want to try to do as much of that matching as we can with data science and with machine learning and algorithms. So ML is literally the core of the business. And if we weren't able to run experiments on ML in the way that we wanted, why even get a testing tool, right? Like we could pay the money to optimize our app a little bit, but the impact that we see from doing that, just to throw out sort of a relative number, we might see a couple $100,000 in improvement from UX changes. We might see several $100 million in improvement from changing our experimenting on our algorithms. So that was a trade-off we have to make. Like if paying the money for the developer allows us to do experimentation on this hugely critical functionality, it was actually more than justified.
Yeah. Yeah, so in that sense, it sounds like a relatively easy business case. I mean, the existing platforms don't even do what you want them to do and don't apply to your business. So, but was it a complete start from scratch, or were there some things in the machine learning community and the testing community out there that you could use or reuse, anything open source?
We didn't open source anything. There's a few things. There are some things that are open source that you could reuse if you wanted to take a less expensive route than we did. At least there's some stuff now. I don't know if back then when the platform first started, which was actually a couple years ago, that there was anything of any good out there. Really, the most complicated piece from an engineering perspective that we needed to think about was assignment. And that's the process of when a randomization entity, it could be a user. In our case, we like to randomize on shipments and sort of lanes, which is like from Seattle to San Francisco, essentially a distance between 2 points. Yeah. whenever that unit, that new entity is available to have a test run on it, you have to randomize them. And that seems like something that you could do relatively easily by flipping a coin, but it's actually not that easy. There's a lot that you have to think about when it comes to scale. If you get 1 million requests to randomize in the span of a second, which can happen if if there's like a bug or something like that, you don't want the whole business to fall down. If you're dialing traffic up and down, you don't want people to get re-randomized every single time. So that was an early investment that we had to make that didn't really have an open source solution. Yeah, that was probably the biggest one.
Yeah. Were there big changes this year in all those algorithms that had to change based on the things happening in the world?
Yeah, there were. Right. Yeah, definitely. The freight market in general is super volatile, and it's very, very sensitive especially sensitive to things like COVID, but even seasonality. We see freight, the margin that we're making on any particular shipment will, really fluctuate wildly throughout the year. So when COVID hit, we saw some of the biggest swings that we've ever seen. And we had to really think about how we could tune our models more for stability. So during that time, experimentation was actually super, super critical.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. Interesting. And how do you get everyone in the company? I can imagine this is quite a complex matter that you're trying to optimize for. It's machine learning. On top of that, there's a lot of experimentation. How do you get the company? How do you get buy-in from everyone in the company to embrace this?
Mm-hmm. To embrace experimentation, just in general.
Yeah.
The way that I've found a lot of success is by focusing on measurement and by asking the question: if you're making some change, whatever that change is, it could be a web change, it could be a change that's happening offline, it could be a change to a model, it could be a strategy process change, right? How do you actually know that the thing that you did worked? Like, how do you know for sure? How do you prove it?
So basically, you're asking questions to make people insecure.
Yeah.
How do you know?
Make them insecure, but also oftentimes most people who run these teams are very smart, right? Like they know what they're doing. They know that they probably can't measure it very well. And when the perspective that you come at them with is experimentation is a solution to a measurement problem that you have. And because what their job is to do is to make the company a whole bunch of money, prove it, and then increase their headcount. If I can go to you and say, I can help you prove it, meaning I can help your team get funded better, then that's a much easier way to get adopted than like, here's 10 test ideas that you could run that I think might make you money, but you have to give me resources for that.
Yeah. And in that sense, do you feel like that's a culture of innovation and a culture of experimentation? Is that similar or?
Culture of innovation and experimentation are very similar. I think it's slightly different. I think that a culture of experimentation is almost like saying a culture of science, meaning when we are making a claim about the world, can we point to some evidence, usually statistical evidence, that backs up our claims? Yeah. A culture of innovation isn't quite the same as that, but it's closer to, are we consistently taking risks? Are we taking chances? Are we doing things that, otherwise people in our position would be scared to do? And then can we combine the two to then measure those risk-taking opportunities with statistics?
Okay. And this is also something that your platform tries to enable within the company, or is it purely for running the experiment and then it's done, or?
For our platform, we focus pretty much on, that's not exactly true. So we do focus pretty strongly on experimentation, but our platform was designed to be super flexible. So the idea is any type of statistical model you want to use, you can use it. Any type of metric you want to use, you can do that. And you can do it all basically, for the most part, out of the box. Any type of dimension you have, you can do that. So you could slice it by anything. So the practical effect of that we've seen is that people will use the tool to do some really crazy stuff and to test, I'll say, innovative things that most people using a third-party platform maybe wouldn't test. So as an example, we have this concept at Convoy of pilots, where a pilot is just something that you just do. You turn it on, and then you have to have some way of like measuring it over time. So if you're on the ops team, for example, and you're trying to build something that maybe makes the op team slightly more efficient, or maybe automate some of the emails that they get, that's not really something that you can A/B test. You know, you don't want 50% of your ops team to have to open emails and they have a standard operating procedure and it doesn't match with the rest of the ops team. So they just turn it on. And what we've been seeing is this move to using an experimentation platform to start measuring these types of changes as well.
SiteSpect offers a worldwide unique A/B testing, personalization, and product recommendation solution. SiteSpect works server-side without any tags or scripts, which guarantees an optimal performance. The SiteSpect solution eliminates delays and the chance of any flickering effects, and this approach also ensures that the current and future browser security rules like ITP and ETP don't make an impact on your A/B testing and personalizations. For more info, visit sitespect.com. What kind of KPIs are you guys optimizing for? So if you have all these different teams doing the experimentation, are they optimizing for the same thing ultimately, or?
No. Most teams have a specific set of metrics that they're accountable to every quarter, every half year. This is like the OKR type of approach.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. But at the same time, we do have what we call core metrics. So these are things that the entire business really cares about. And we haven't implemented this yet, but what we're trying to move to is any of those core metrics that can be run on an experiment. So like variable cost per shipment is something that we like to think about. Are we reducing or increasing the amount of variable cost every time a new shipment sort of comes in on our platform? That's a really important metric to the company. And if somebody's running a shipment level experiment, then what our platform can do is automatically track that metric, whether or not the team actually wanted to include it.
Okay, clear. And then they pick the statistical model themselves, you say. And of course, it's nice to have that. That's great to have that flexibility, but it also puts a lot of responsibility in the person designing the experiment, of course. So how do you make sure that people, they pick the right statistical model?
Yeah, that's a good question. For the most part at Convoy, our experiments are designed by data scientists. So these are generally not people who are like encountering experimentation for the very first time. They usually have a pretty good concept of, this is the statistical technique that I want to use that makes the most sense for my use case. And we're just giving them a forum to select that. Now, I do think something that we should probably do as the future goes on, because we do want to make experimentation more accessible to everybody, is probably have a set of predefined templates. Say, okay, if you want to do an offline experiment and here's some criteria that you have to meet, then you just run this one. If you want to do an online experiment and it's a relatively simple A/B test on the internet, then you can just use a t-test, and we sort of bundle all that stuff together.
Yeah. So are you already applying some machine learning techniques on the experimentation platform itself to help the experimenters? Or
No, we're not. But that is probably going to be our some of our goals for the platform in 2021. And really, that's less about being smart right now, like being really, really smart about like which test wins and which loses and these types of things. And more about, can we automate some of the work that our analysts and data scientists are doing, and allow a machine to take over in places where a human being doing all this digging and segmentation to find interesting things is pretty unreasonable.
Yeah, and that's I mean, a lot of data scientists and a lot of web analysts are often sadly used to create reports, right?
Right. Yeah.
that's not something you should be doing. Actually, you should automate all those things, and then when automation goes wrong, sure, you step in. But that's not something that the data scientist should be doing.
Yeah, it's a waste of time, right? Like the data science best resource is their brain. And it's the critical thinking part that's important and valuable. It's not like doing the same thing over and over again, munging the data, putting it into the right format, finding outliers. A machine can do all of that stuff.
Yeah, don't waste that brain on creating PowerPoints and stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So when are you gonna spin off the product and create your own A/B testing company?
Probably never. Honestly, there are some great tools out there. I would not envy anybody in the A/B testing space. I think you saw Optimizely got acquired. I don't remember how long ago. Pretty recently, like a couple weeks ago now.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, Episerver.
Yeah, Optimizely got acquired, and they were kind of the golden boys of this space. And I don't know. I just wouldn't want to. There's a lot of competitors that do a lot of really interesting things, and I don't know if I would be interested in going head to head with any of them.
Exactly, but it does sound like there's a big gap in the market, right? For B2B companies that are open to experimentation, that open to learning, but don't have the traffic on their website maybe to do it. But can you talk to those companies a bit? What are the things that you can experiment on? How can you be creative in that? Maybe you don't have enough traffic on your website, but what are the things that you can experiment on?
Yeah. So, I'm sure you know this, but there's a inverse correlation with the amount of traffic you have and the size of the impact that you need to see before you can detect something. Convoy has that same problem. And there's really no statistical algorithm that can ever sort of change that fundamental issue. So that plays a really big effect on how we do experimentation. Instead of looking at things like, well, let's optimize the UX flow, let's change a button color here or there, maybe try changing some copy. The only things that we look at are big changes, which kind of flies in the face of typical advice. Make an incremental change, and then you'll be able to prove that this is the real thing, and this is what caused the change, and then you can increment from there. I actually think that for a lot of companies, that's a really bad way of testing, because incrementality is not going to deliver very many business results. So instead, really taking a long time to think about your customer, thinking about what are the major new features and offerings that we can provide, doing some deep user research and pre-testing on that, and then having a really strong opinion on, I believe that this thing is going to be a giant improvement for the company, and then using experimentation as a validation tool for all of that research you've done. That's sort of the process I would suggest to a B2B. The last thing I'll say about that is, what a lot of people actually don't know is that a lot of these techniques, take this sort of incremental approach to experimentation, it started at massive companies like Google and Microsoft. So for them, it makes sense, right? When you have billions and billions of users that are coming to your site every day, the amount of change, the amount of impact that you can detect is extremely small, and you can detect it in a couple days. So it actually makes total sense for them to make those incremental changes, because they can see them all and they can see them really quickly. But for everybody else, it's kind of insane advice, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for all the talks that I have with people in CRO, the most creative things come from people that don't have that amount of traffic. The amount of traffic, if you have a lot of traffic, it basically makes you lazy.
Yeah.
And it hampers your creativity. It's not great for your innovation, and usually those bigger things are also, well, for me at least, they're more fun to work on.
Yeah, I agree. We've seen some really cool stuff in Convoy where I'm constantly amazed at some of the tests that are coming out. One that I thought was really, really cool is we have a process called an RFP that we go through with our partners, our shipper partners, where we essentially bid on the shipments that they have available. And we had a team that started doing experimentation on those bids. So when they would come in from a big shipper, we would randomize the response that we gave. So we would have some prediction of this is what we think this particular shipment is going to cost. when we put it on the market. We would supply a premium to some of them, a discount to some of them, and then like an Uber premium to some of them, and send those back, and do an experiment there. And that was awesome, and actually like extremely, extremely impactful. And it's just a creative thing that you have to do, exactly as you said, when you don't have a lot of budget to, build some like amazing, really complex system.
Yeah, exactly. Do you guys also do offline testing?
We do. Yeah, we do.
So do you have some examples?
Yeah, pretty much all of our examples so we actually have an internal tool that we call Kingpin. And Kingpin is essentially it's a platform for the operations team, so that they can see, when are details about all the shipments and when they're arriving and when the orders are going out and whether they're on time or not and things like that. And one of the issues there is that the team who sort of manages those tools are constantly trying to make improvements to them so that they can make our operations team more efficient. But sort of like I mentioned before, if you make a change to that platform, then you need to actually make it for the entire operations team, because ops team members, not only do they communicate with each other really, really closely, but you'll need to know, for example, if somebody took a particular action on a shipment and then it went back into the system and then it came back and now an ops personnel has to take another action, you definitely don't want to run an experiment where some things are visible and other things are invisible. It will just confuse ops people if the SOPs are pretty significantly different. And you're sitting right next to somebody and you're looking at a screen and you need help with something and you look over and their screen is something different because they're getting a different version of that. So these are the types of offline experiments where we really have to think more like a lawmaker. So lawmakers running experiments on laws is actually quite common, where somebody will say, we have created a law and we are going to ship it in one part of the country for a certain period of time, see what the effect is, and then roll it out everywhere else. That is an experiment, and that is a type of experimentation that we try to do relatively frequently.
Yeah, what are the main differences when you're going to set up an offline, still digital, but offline experiment, not web experiment, versus a web experiment?
I would say the big differences are typically you can't control your randomization as much, right? When you're online, you have a very tight control over which user gets to see which thing. And in the real world, that may not always be the case. So you have to come up with creative ways to bucket your control and treatment. The example I gave a second ago, what we did was we put everybody before the time that we launched the experiment into the control, and everybody after we launched the experiment into the treatment. And then we used the time that the feature launched as sort of the dividing line between those two things. And then we had our two buckets and we could actually compare. And there's some other mechanisms that you could use to take away bias and this type of stuff. But like just that level of thinking is really important. And there actually are times when you can do randomization offline. So when I used to work at Subway, we would very, very frequently roll out new sandwiches and new features to a trial population. And you just have to be specific and very careful about which stores you roll out to. Often, because Subway is a franchisee restaurant, like you have, it's franchisee owned. Yep. There's no sort of ownership on the Subway side. So that means in order to trial a new sandwich, you have to opt in. And the people who are opting in are obviously not necessarily the same stores as the one who are not opting in. So like those are the types of things that you have to think about when you're experimenting offline.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so some fun challenges there if you do that. And do you also do experiments that are not even digital, or do you do you like?
We haven't done too many of those at Convoy. That is something I'm very familiar with. I think there's a lot of I mean, they're not e-commerce, but just regular commerce, I guess.
Those still exist, yeah.
Those still exist. But in any place where you have an offline store, so that was definitely the case with Sephora, and it was also the case with Subway. There was a pretty good amount of totally offline experimentation where we had almost no insight from the digital perspective what was going on. And at Subway in particular, they experimented on everything. They would experiment on like opening times and closing times and staffing and how they arranged the actual ingredients to build the sandwich, and things that they tried to shorten the lines or potentially make the lines longer, all types of stuff like that. They ran experiments. And really running the experiment is relatively trivial if you're able to get your randomization right. So if you're able to figure out that, how do we bucket control and treatment in a way that's trustworthy? There's a ton of stuff that you can do after that.
Yeah. And for all these experiments, and also at offline and online, where do you guys get your basically your inspiration? It sounds a bit random, but where do the ideas for these experiments come from? Do you do a lot of user research? Are those surveys? Or I can imagine that's also a bit harder to do when you don't have the numbers.
Yeah, it can be certainly more challenging. I think the good thing about these types of offline experiments is that your customers are definitely a little bit more approachable, in the sense of you have some insight into their day-to-day activities that perhaps extend beyond the web, right? The challenge in digital is like, I have no idea who that person is that just bought something.
Yeah, it can be anyone. And in B2B, by definition, you have a business relationship with them. So you basically know who your audience is.
Yeah, you know who your audience is. Hopefully, if you've built up a pretty good rapport with them, then it's easy to reach out to them and talk to them, and they're friendly.
Hopefully, yeah. Hopefully. But that's that's basically the main way you guys get input for experiments, or?
Yeah, I think user research and a lot of direct talking to customers is a lot of where that comes from. I think there are certainly places that are more analytical. So, for example, something that I know the operations team thinks about relatively frequently is emails. And when you're in ops, you have to respond to a lot of emails coming in from shippers, emails coming in from truckers. And if you build instrumentation into your platform, or you're using a third-party service that is able to collect and track all these emails for you, then you can see where people are spending their time. And if you have some type of categorization mechanism, you can see the specific type of emails that they spend a long time replying back to, and when are they getting replied back to, and sort of what's the delta between when the email is received and when it's responded to, right? Like you have all this data. And that's another sort of inspiration point. Obviously, not just emails, but any other place where you're able to capture sort of the behavior of whatever your customer is. That's another place that we've seen experiment inspiration come from.
In the past year, marketing budgets have suffered, and the share for A/B testing has been impacted too. If you want to keep testing to enterprise standards, but save 80% on your annual contract, you can consider Convert.com. With their latest release, you can take advantage of full stack and hybrid features, strong privacy compliance, no blink, and enterprise-grade security. Feel good about a smart business decision, invest what you save back into your Zero program. Check it out at Convert.com. And now looking back, you've worked for Convoy for a year. What's your second year going to be like? What are you going to focus on?
Yeah. So our first year, my first year at Convoy was really about making the entire experimentation funnel, I guess you could call it, really simple, really usable, really straightforward. So when I was there, it was possible to deploy an experiment, but analysis was pretty challenging. We didn't really have this bring your own algorithm component. That's something new that we added. We didn't have the ability to automate a workflow, which is another really big thing. That's basically being able to say, I want to do something really interesting. So maybe I want to start my experiment at 1% traffic. I want to create a bunch of monitors that check whether or not some metrics are failing. And then if the answer is, if everything looks good, then I want to roll that up to 5%, check the monitors again, then roll it up to 50% and start computing a totally different set of metrics. Maybe for the first few days, I only want to look at those super short-term metrics that are really good indicators of whether or not it's an experiment failing. And then after that, I want to start looking at more longer term metrics. And there is a cost component there. A lot of people don't see that because that's abstracted away by the A/B testing company. But when you're doing these large scale computations of data, that really, in essence, that's what you're paying for. You're paying for like all these joins across, hundreds of thousands or hundreds of millions of data points. So there is a cost component there that we try to affect positively. So that was 2020. And 2021 is more about analysis. So we've solved most of that problem. And now it's going to be, how do we get data scientists out of the business of spending so much time doing debugging and, like doing this type of segment discovery. So what segment actually performed well and what didn't, and trying to automate as much of that as we can.
Okay. And where do you think you stand in a year?
I think we're in a pretty good place. I think end of the year, I think most of the big analytical insight automation work is done. And I think the next big challenge is, how do we start meaningfully reducing the time that it takes to run experiments? Like, that's going to be my big sort of post 2021 goal, is with small sample sizes, how can we cut the runtime before you can make a decision by like 50%?
Okay. Are there other KPIs that you're looking for the experimentation program itself?
We look at a few things. The big goal for us right now is templatization. So how many experiments get run that are templatized? At one point, we did have like pure numbers of experiments. It's still something that we track and we report on, but it's not sort of our key goal anymore. And the reason we're focusing on templatization is we can say that when someone runs an experiment that was essentially pre-built, they're just changing the content, there's a lot of time savings happening. A data scientist doesn't have to select the metrics. They don't have to choose the algorithm. They don't have to set the sample size or do the workflow. So there's like several hours to more than a day of savings there. And we're just adding all that up. It's like a productivity enhancement for the business.
Okay. But then almost by definition, those are not the most creative experiments, right? Because there's a template for them, or...
No. So the template really only applies to the design, but the actual experiment itself is usually pretty open. So they can experiment on anything, but you may want to say, for example, I'm doing some crazy new change, but there's actually a pattern for testing that type of crazy change. And I just want to use that like measurement pattern and that algorithmic pattern. Okay,
fair enough. And you've been to podcasts before. You've been to Zero events before, sat on panels before. Maybe you've touched on it in the past hour already. But what do you think the insights? What are the insights that you have based on what you've done with Zero before that you don't see a lot of other zeros have or apply?
Yeah, good question. So I think, there's a couple answers here. One thing is, I think, and probably I contributed to this, honestly, but I think that people get too worked up about the statistics. I think they care way too much. When you are running an experiment, the real question that you should ask from like what statistics do I use perspective shouldn't be like which one performs the best in simulations or whatever it is. I mean, that's fine. But the question is, would a different algorithm have resulted in a practically different result? And if the answer is no, and in the vast majority of cases it is no, then it doesn't matter, right? Who cares? Yeah. It's a waste of time to think about. That's one thing. Another thing, I think I already sort of talked about this incrementality thing that I really dislike before, but I think using, I got one. I have a good one, actually. So this is something we haven't really talked about yet. I think something that CROs do, which is not great, is use the results of an experiment as a forecast for the future. So that's to say, this experiment made $50,000 over the course of the test, and I ran it in 2 weeks. And so if I continue to run it for an additional full 50 weeks at 100%, then I should make, 10 million or whatever the number is.
Mm-hmm.
That's not right. and the reason it's not right is because the outcome of a statistical test, a p-value, is not predictive. It's actually backwards looking, right? It's showing you this is what happened at some point in the past. It doesn't say anything about what's going to happen next month or the month after that or 6 months after that.
I think, or maybe hope, that a lot of CRO specialists do know this, but they are kind of forced almost by managers or of their team or company or whatever to do predictions, to say, okay, what is the value that you've added as a CRO specialist or CRO team?
Yeah, exactly.
So what are better ways for them to do this?
Yeah, so I think
this is not it.
I think there's sort of two philosophical perspectives that you could take, right? You could take the perspective of as a experimentation team or as a CRO team, it's actually not our job to add a whole bunch of money bottom line to the business. That's like not what we're here for. What you could say is, what my real job is to go and think about really interesting things that we could be investing in, new products, new features, new whatever it is, and validate those offline. So validate those with our customers and validate those through user testing. And then experimentation just becomes a mechanism, like basically a guardrail to say, is anything going wrong here, right? So that's one way that you could use experimentation that's 100% valid. And I've actually seen quite a few businesses that are starting to think about A/B testing in this way when they don't have predictive capabilities. And the way as a team that you justify that is you say, well, listen, we actually caught 20 out of 30 things that were bad, right? And we know that this would have harmed the business in some meaningful way. Because we caught them in a parallel universe where we didn't have A/B testing, we would have deployed them, right? So that means that you could say, we know for a fact that this thing would have hurt us by $10,000 or $20,000 or whatever it is. And we don't know exactly what the pain would have been over a long period of time, but we know that it probably wouldn't have been $10,000 or $20,000. So we're actually saving the company money. And the more experiments that we do, the more money that we know we can save. That's one perspective you could take. The other thing that you could do, if you really want to show ROI, is invest in a forecast and invest in a forecasting predictive metric. This is actually something that we've done at Convoy as well. And essentially what you do, and this does require some data science / analyst effort. So it's not cheap and it's not certainly not free, but it could be cheap. I guess it depends on sort of, who's on staff. But essentially what you do is you can build some type of predictive model that takes in a set of short-term KPIs and looks at your data and looks at how those short-term KPIs influence longer-term KPIs. And you could say, based on how the market is fluctuating and based on the historical performance of our tests over long periods of time, and based on how these metrics typically move together, we think that this experiment is going to deliver a 3% revenue uplift over 6 months, right? And then you're still going to be wrong, but at least you're going to probably be a lot less wrong than if you're just using a p-value as a forecast.
Yeah, that's great insight, I think. Thanks. So a final thing I wanted to talk to you about, experiment.expert.
Yes.
That's the website that you've started?
Yeah.
So what is it?
So this is new. I was, a few months ago, I realized that I have talked to a lot of people in the space about experimentation, and I think in general, a lot of these problems around A/B testing are a lot more complex than sometimes people can think. And learning about them from a high level is great, but when you actually go to implement, there's a lot of problems.
Stuff breaks.
Right? Stuff breaks. It doesn't work the way that we expect. We make I think Luke W. from Google made a post. This is a while ago, maybe over a year ago, where he was kind of, taking the stuff out of A/B testing. He said, these are the results that CROs say A/B testing has delivered. but here's the actual sort of business trend, and they're in like diverging directions, you know. And those are the types of things that happen because there's just a lot more complexity to this that people realize. So I started thinking, since I've been in this complex space for a while and I've solved a lot of those challenges, it would be cool to provide some of that information back and to work with teams and potentially individuals and consultancies on like really going deep theoretically and scientifically. So that's what that website is about.
So people can hire you as like a mentor, or are you actually working with them? Or
I probably don't have the time to do the actual work. I wish that would be really fun. But yeah, as a mentor or sort of working through particular use cases or problems, whether it's like culture related or science related, anything experimentation related is stuff that I love and would be willing to and always able to talk about.
Awesome. So if people are interested in that, the link is in the show notes of this episode. My final question then. Who should I invite for an upcoming Zero Cafe episode? Who has something to tell about a topic that you think that's really interesting?
Yeah, so I definitely think Jeff Ferris. If you want another person from Convoy, Jeff Ferris would be somebody great to have. Jeff is a economist. He formerly was at Amazon, and he was working with the experimentation team at Amazon for a really long time. And his specialty is in this type of long-term prediction and making predictions about the world and also in experiments. So there's some really, really cool stuff that he's done in the past. Another person that I think would be really interesting to talk to, I don't know if you've had Jonas on. Jonas, oh man, his last name escapes me, but he's building an A/B testing tool himself, formerly at Booking, and taking a bit of a different approach to the A/B testing sort of thought process and mentality. Jonas Alford. Sorry, Jonas. But super, super smart guy, great to talk to, knows a lot about experimentation, A/B testing, and just a wellspring of knowledge.
Cool. Well, if you can introduce me to both, then that would be great. And then we'll invite them for an upcoming episode.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Chad. Our time is up, unfortunately. Thank you so much for sharing all your insights. I think there's a lot of knowledge in there that we can definitely use and hopefully apply to our own Zero work. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Guido.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And this concludes Season 3, Episode 2 of the Zero Cafe podcast with Chad Sanderson. Make sure to check out the show notes on the Zero Cafe website. Next episode, I talk with Eltine van der Veer. She's Head of Experience and Insights at Braingineers, and we're talking about why humanizing data, especially in these times of decreased human contact, is so important. Talk to you then, and always be optimizing.
Will this work? Maybe not. Isn't that what we're all trying to figure out? With VWO, create and A/B test different variations of your website to continuously discover the best performing versions that improve conversions. Stop guessing. Start A/B testing with VWO today.